Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am UrzaMaster. Joining me as always, we've got Fert Derby and Lord Uther on the panel here at Starfleet Academy headquarters, satellite, deep space, whatever you want to call it. And we are on the monumental episode of Star Trek titled Let This Be Your Last Battlefield. I don't want to dig too much into it beyond the name, but Fert Derby, we've got a lot to talk about here. Why don't you take us away?
Thank you, UrzaMaster, Lord Uther, Warp Core fans. Welcome back to the second half of Season 3, Star Trek. Let that be your last battlefield. It aired on January 10th, 1969. We are fully into January of 69. We have Judd Taylor directing. Judd Taylor gave us the Paradise Syndrome in Season 3, which we talked about in Warp Core 68. That's the one where Kirk got zapped and then thought he was a Native American. Boo. But then he also directed Wink of an Eye in the Season 3, Warp Core 76. And we liked that one, where Kirk had to deal with super fast aliens who were trying to take over the ship. So this is sort of a rubber match for Judd. Is it a good one? Is it a bad one? He's done both. We will see. It is also the last story credit for former showrunner Gene L. Coon. Gene L. Coon, who was running things in Seasons 1 and 2, took a step back, but still contributed to the writer's room. This is the last credited script that he had input on, although he did do it under his famous pseudonym Lee Cronin. But this was a Gene L. Coon story. We don't have time to go into all of Gene's contributions. Warp Core fans, Star Trek fans, you know what he did and what he's responsible for. Just this season alone, he gave us Wink of an Eye with Judd Taylor that we just talked about. Fast Aliens, we liked it. But he also gave us Spectre of the Gun, Enterprise Crew versus the Earp Brothers. Not so good. Yee. So anyways, as you can see, a mixed quality bag. The actual script was credited to Oliver Crawford. He's written for Trek once in the first season. He did the Galileo 7 episode in which McCoy and Spock and other crew members were trapped on a rock planet and had to decide how they were going to get off without sacrificing any of their fellow crew members. We talked about that all the way back in Warp Core 35. Check the archives. I think we liked it. We also had two guest stars, primary guest stars in here. Lou Antonio played Lokai, who was white on one side and black on the other. And Frank Gorshin played Bell. Frank Gorshin, of course, was the Riddler in Adam West's Batman television series. And whatever face paintings Lou Antonio had, white, black, Gorshin was white, black. So they were all in opposition for each other. And gentlemen, that's kind of where it leads my major note for Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. There's 1969 Fert Derby and there's 2024 Fert Derby. And it'd be very easy to review this episode through the 2024 lens. But I want to look at it through 1969 first, briefly, and then explain my objection to it. Here's a show that tried to give voice to the idea of runaway slaves, slavery, the Civil War, the war to end all wars, the fight that split the Union. And in doing so, had both sides making their case and the Enterprise crew caught in the middle. And this is, in theory, what we've been saying all along, what Gene Roddenberry and the mission was to try to bring about social change, to try to engineer conversations about issues, to try and make science fiction not just ray guns and exploding asteroids, but something meaningful. And so that's what this episode was going for. It also did so in a fairly in-your-face, transparent way. There was no real need for subtlety or so forth, and they wore their arguments on their sleeves. And that's fine, again, for a 1969 audience. But gentlemen, I will make this case. I think this exact material, or something along a similar paradigm, would probably be even more effective and even more compelling and even more dramatic in a 2024 lens, particularly if this was on a Star Trek Strange New Worlds. I'm sure the Next Gen and some of the other shows may have skirted around, episodes like this. You guys can check your holodeck archives to see. My biggest problem was Lou Antonio as Lokai was making the case for being enslaved, and Frank Gorshin was the plantation overseer, if you will, who wanted his property returned, and these guys were traitors. Gorshin, if you're going to put him on the side of the villain in this argument, Gorshin does an effective job of conveying the mentality, if you will, of what probably Southerners were feeling during the Civil War. Antonio makes the case for the other side, for slaves who wanted to be freed and didn't want to be under a tyrant's heel. But I really wish they could have articulated that with an actor of color, or maybe ditched the gimmick of the face painting and had a white and a black man arguing those cases. And if that's too obvious, flip the roles. In 1995, John Travolta and Harry Belafonte did a picture called White Man's Burden, which did an alternate history in which it was the black population who came out as the elites and all of that, and it was the white population who were impoverished, forced to live, in like urbanized ghettos and so forth. And so it tried to approach the argument that, John Travolta was desperate, Harry Belafonte had all the cards, and it was a confrontation between those two social statuses and so forth. And the picture came and went. It didn't leave a lasting impression on the zeitgeist, as I recall, but it is an interesting thought experiment if you want to check it out. I guess I just was uncomfortable 2024 Fert Derby, hearing a white actor sort of appropriate those arguments and that part of the script, whereas, it might have just made more sense to be able to play it out, might have driven it more home to a Star Trek audience or a television audience, to hear some of those, pros, cons, so forth, being explained in a way, in a new context, in a science fiction context. Who knows? Could they have won hearts and minds in 1969? There's a fairly good chance. And I think if you did that episode today with Strange New Worlds or one of the other Star Trek vehicles, I think they absolutely would, try and make it a little bit more balanced and sensitive to the times and so forth. And you could even go deeper than they were willing to go in 1969. Because again, this was skirting the envelope stuff. This was probably making the NBC guys upstairs a little uncomfortable that they would be so direct in dealing with racial tensions and inequalities. Again, 1969. So I like the argument. I like that Star Trek was not afraid to make it. And I think the writing to that point illustrates that well. I'm just sitting where I'm sitting now as, someone of 50 plus years. I would have done things differently. I don't have that luxury of being in 69, but I definitely would do it differently in 2024. So gentlemen, what say you on Battlefields?
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. Certainly for me, this is a really high point of season 3 of Star Trek. I loved everything about this episode, top to bottom. I enjoyed the on the noseness of it in terms of racial tension. For me, it was less of being uncomfortable with who they chose to portray these aliens, because I bought it under the guise of these are aliens. I know what they're talking about, but I don't know that you necessarily have to have a certain person cast to make those arguments. I think it's even more poignant when somebody's advocating for someone they don't understand necessarily, but I think you do it differently. And I think they did it successfully here, where it wasn't, and I'm going to use a term that's thrown around a little bit nowadays. If I'm looking, and this is from a today's lens, not from a historical point of view, I like it when the advocate is not just outraged on the behalf of. I find that to be far more appropriating than somebody who's genuinely sympathetic and trying to represent something in a novel way, which I think is what they're doing by making these both aliens. Because they are, to the untrained eye, telling a story about aliens. And I think that's where some folks who, maybe didn't quite pick up on what they were talking about could still enjoy the episode. Call them the ignorant, call them whatever. So you're not really taking away. And some people who maybe wouldn't grasp it if you had, a person of color representing the people of color versus, the way they did cast it, they might shut their ears off to it otherwise. And if you have it this way, I think in some cases, the folks that do get it, who may not be comfortable with an appropriate casting, let's say, might actually listen. They might open their ears to it a bit. And it doesn't bludgeon you with the information. It doesn't guilt you. It just presents it in a way that it's like an examination. There's an obvious context to this, especially when you finally do get to their planet and you see they've devastated each other to the point where these are the last two, and they can't help themselves, right? And that's the trappings, I think, that they're trying to really convey, more so than the on-the-nose type information of like, hey, this is just utterly silly. And it is. But there's real consequence here. And it's not about just punishing one or the other, because the best thing I think they did in this episode is they painted both sides as, to some degree, in the wrong. And
Right.
that there needed to be some, discourse and concessions and or, compromise. And it was a much more nuanced argument than I think sometimes in modern television than we're willing to even make. There's a lot of demonizing one group or another from any side of any argument. And I don't mean to make it political, but we see it in politics a lot. But we also see it in other things, sometimes very benign things, like people who enjoy pineapple on pizza seem to get demonized. Now, don't get me wrong, that is a truly silly argument. Who cares what you put on your pizza? I don't. Some people like raw onions on their pizza. They're wrong, but they do. They like it. But, it's just one of those things that I think what this episode did best was it did draw the context away from, where I think A Strange New Worlds could easily go wrong, and kind of deliver this in a sense that's a little bit more, I don't know, Smash Mouth style. Where they're upfront about, because easily they could do a political driven episode, left versus right or whatever you want to look at it, and it could be really well done. My fear is, even with the great writers we have on that show now, it's also very, very easy to make it seem like there's not nuance to those arguments. And that's something I just think they did better in the day when maybe the casting wasn't what we might want it to be, which I don't necessarily think is as big of a problem as folks tend to make it out to be, because if it's artfully done, I think, as it is here, you don't really need a specific person to deliver it. Now, don't get me wrong, if they put Sidney Poitier in this episode, it's going to be fantastic. But if you're just pigeonholing somebody and they're like, oh, we need a black guy to talk about black guy things, I don't like that casting either. So it's, it's just, I love that Roddenberry had a very specific vision, but knew enough to flare it up a little so that it didn't punch you in the face, it didn't guilt you, it made you think. And provocation of thought is what Star Trek is at its best. This is a fundamental Star Trek episode when it comes to that. You will not leave this episode without at least pondering, how did it come to this for these people? Because we really don't quite get that answer, right? All we know is that when we get there, everything's destroyed, there's dead bodies everywhere, and we've seen these two petty, argumentative kind of dickheads kind of run roughshod on the Enterprise. And the Enterprise crew is just like, look, We're not saying we're not going to help resolve this somehow. We just need to do it through the proper channels, through the proper authorities, and it's not good enough. And that, in and of itself, is a great message. So yes, I would do it differently today, but I would probably do a lot of similar things. I wouldn't make it, mostly because when it is so on the nose these days, it's painfully on the nose. I look at Red Panda. I don't need to say much more about that, but if there is nothing so more painfully on the nose with its messaging, it is a children's movie trying to explain puberty. Inside Out 2, much better. Much better. And really, I don't have a huge preference between either one. They're both kids' movies, and I enjoyed both. But it's art. It's craft that counts there. You can make the same statements without having to really hit somebody in the face. And I'll leave it at that for Lord Uther to pick up the pieces.
Picking up the pieces. Well, I think this episode dances around it without dancing in it, and that's okay, because it's, well, we talk about this all the time. It's great writing, and which was making me ponder in general, because I'm going somewhere with this. Could you do this episode today? Which is like this argument of, could you do Tropic Thunder today? Is that possible? And is that wrong or is that right? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And that's something I'm still trying to figure out, because not to go down a rabbit hole, or to, like you said earlier, to make it political, but again, could you do an episode like this? I don't know. I don't know what would it look like. Would you be able to, like I said, to dance around it without dancing in it? Because, again, to your point, it seems like nowadays you're either hit over the head with something, or you're painted into a corner with something. It's blatantly obvious, and I don't feel like this episode. Yes, we knew what we were getting. We knew what they were getting at without getting at it. And then I also think it brings up the point of history being cyclical. Like, can you ever really truly break a cycle? And here they are, the last two people left of their species, whatever, of their, if that's what we want to call them, or of their people, and they're willing to go back down to the planet and just completely throw it all away. Like, yeah, that's right, it's over. Okay, we can't get past this still, even though we're the last two left, and let's just kind of end it. And I don't know, it just makes you ponder those things.
That brings up a really good question, though. Not to step on.
No, of course it
Fert
does
Derby,
bring up a good question, but go ahead.
but I have to bring up this point. What does this episode say about what it's talking about by having there be only these two left and everybody else is dead? So let's just take this to hypothetical. Let's say they decide, oh crap, wow, like this happened. What future is there for their species? We don't know how they reproduce. Maybe they reproduce sexually like normal humans do, and there's only two males left. So at that point, does it really matter what they do? I mean, may they not, might as well just have it out? Because if they have to go on breeding, maybe they can't breed with any other species. You know, it's just interesting. They kind of make it, they kind of defeat the whole argument by having it completely wiped out. I think if we put it in a modern context, you'd have to flip the script and say that they've been on the run hunting each other for so long. When they get back, their planet's actually figured out harmony. And their planet has actually, you know, would treat them both as criminals because both were so deeply wrong on each side. And they haven't had the 50,000 years of reconciliation and rebuilding and, you know, reparation. Sorry, Fert Derby, you had something to say.
No, that's exactly right, because in this case, I felt like you raise the question, but then you don't want to answer it for fear of, you know, the one side or the other. Like Kirk, they keep saying, let's take this to let's take this to the authorities, let's go through the channels, and that's the sensible thing to do. But they don't take a side, right? Lokai is accused by Bell of like horrific crimes. We don't know whether to judge the veracity of that. And even if we were inclined to believe Lokai, he's the one who keeps saying, kill him, violence, blah, blah, blah. He must be wiped out. And there's an ambiguity to both of them. I feel like they're both unreliable narrators. We're not really getting the full picture of, that Bell might not be as horrific as Lokai claims, and Lokai might not be as innocent. He stole a shuttlecraft. He's sort of an unrepentant freedom fighter / terrorist. We've had that argument in our Graying Jedi podcasts. To the Empire, the Rebel Alliance are terrorists. To the rest of the galaxy that doesn't like the Empire, they're freedom fighters. So I mean, which side are you on? That's the whole Andor question there. Which, folks, check out our Graying Jedi podcast. We have some spirited discussions there as well. So I just felt like the Enterprise was in like the Kobayashi Maru here. It was a no-win situation. They couldn't side one way or the other. And as a result, I love what you're saying. I love if they had come back and said, boy, you guys are out of step. We figured this out decades ago. And you're both guilty of, overzealousness, so we're going to lock you up. I love that. I hope you're listening, Paramount. We're going to go back in time with the help of the Time Police, and we're going to fix that episode there. I also thought for some reason Lokai reminded me of Patton Oswalt. I don't know if you were getting that or not. I had sort of a thing there. There was a moment early when they cut to Uhura and then Chekhov and Sulu, who had no dialogue, but they were just fiddling with their monitors and looking at screens. And I can just see the director, Judd Taylor, telling his cast, all right, you three, just do bridge stuff. Like there was no dialogue, but it was like Uhura, there. And then they cut to Chekhov and he was adjusting things. They cut to Sulu, who would look up at the monitor, look back down at his. And I also thought when they went to Red Alert, they were very calm. Like Kirk calls for Red Alert General Quarters, and they're just kind of walking through the corridor. And I'm just thinking, well, I mean, if that's a very disciplined crew, but I mean, when do you panic? When are you just like sprinting off the bulkheads and we're all going to die kind of a thing? But they're just kind of like, hey, you hear that? I mean, I've seen more urgent fire drills. And so I thought Judd needed to do that there. And then obviously, gentlemen, someone should mention the Easter egg that you don't know is an Easter egg in 1969, but you do in 1984 because you've watched all these Star Treks and now you're suddenly watching Kirk face off with Commander Krug, and he's got one card left in the deck, and it's the self-destruct sequence to take out NCC 1701. That was a chilling.
And that self-destruct sequence. I mean, we talk about the highs and lows of season 3. What a tense standoff right then and there. My one issue with how they presented that is that wasn't the climax. Like, that should have been a much bigger moment. Not that it wasn't tense and a great moment, but the fact that, like, later on they're like, no, I've disabled your self-destruct. Like, come on. Like, you just undermined probably the biggest tension moment in all of Star Trek to this point, outside of maybe Mark Lenard's first appearance. But, I did like the episode quite a bit. I do think it was intriguing, to say the least. And yeah, I think there's a lot of different things they could do with this, and I hope they do with Strange New Worlds, something to this effect. I think it would be timely, and I think this episode sort of gets at that, right? There's always going to be some argument like this that's timely. And that's what the best sci-fi is timeless representations of humanity and existence. So with that, let's start off with our Warp Core ratings. Season 3, ups and downs, been saying it all show. Let's not isolate this to Season 3, because I think in that canon, you may have an artificially inflated number. But Lord Uther, kick us off. Where do you find this in the scale of 1 to 7 warp cores?
I'll go 5.5 out of 7. I love the to me, the best part. It was a good episode. I love the whole we're going to blow up the Enterprise thing. I mean, and I didn't remember this. It caught me off guard, because I thought it only happened in the movie. So I don't think when I had seen this episode when I was younger, I actually saw the entire episode. I think I just only saw part of it. So I absolutely love that, and I think that's an excellent point. If they put that at the end, to me, maybe it's a 6, maybe it's even a 6.5. But I'll go 5.5. Fert.
I I thought I might start lower, but no, both of your arguments have been compelling. I think 5.5, kissing up against 6 is where it is, because to Ursa's point, this is foundational, this is real, this matters. I'd have to overcome my own inhibitions and so forth. So 5.5, but I'm willing to expand the more I think about it, and maybe on a rewatch.
And honestly, I was going to start at a 5.5, but now thinking about it out loud, I'm going to give it a 6. I think this is probably on my top 10 that I would recommend if you're going to watch TOS. This episode needs to be on your list of watch because it is consequential, not just from the historical point of view, but from the point of view of all of TOS crew canon. I would probably do some structural editing if I was remaking this episode today. But to be frank, I like the casting as is. I think the fact that the actors portraying these two opposing races are actors of the same variety in real life. And I think in a way that almost makes it more poignant because the whole idea is fundamentally they're essentially the same. And that almost adds a layer to it. You know what I mean? Because if they were, let's just say, cast as a white actor and a black actor, there's some cultural difference there that's inseparable. It's a beautiful thing, but it's inseparable. So in a way, regardless of how they might act or how they came up or whatever, how they might carry themselves on screen, they are fundamentally different in a way that either one might not be able to appreciate of the other. But when you have two of the same baseline person, it almost makes that whole difference thing that they're going at that much more absurd. Not to say it's not absurd either way, but it adds a layer of absurdity, which I think is a beautiful thing. And I think it really does highlight the fundamental idea that they're trying to put forth is that, you know, all people are virtually the same. But we also get that in the scene where Spock and Kirk are sitting with them trying to figure, sitting with Lokai trying to figure out, like, well, why are you so different? He's like, well, I'm black on the right half. He's black on the left half. Well, what's there not to understand? And they look at each other like, what? And
Right.
the thing is, Kirk and Spock think of each other in the same light. Spock is a Vulcan. Very different. Green-blooded. McCoy reminds us of it all the time. But Starfleet has this goal of embracing differences but celebrating our sameness. And that's really the message we should be taking away.
Yes.
And that, I think, is the coolest thing, and that's why it's so fundamental to me for Star Trek. That pushes it to a 6. But until we rejoin this 5...
Real quick, we want Spock to call the Kentucky Derby. If you remember that late where he's sitting there trying to, like, they've moved through engineering. Lokai is I just want to hear Leonard Nimoy. Like, I wish I could hear him calling horses.
Yes, that little foot race, it was verging on a little too cheesy for me, but that I realized the whole point is to highlight absurdities in this episode, and I fell in love with it. So I agree that that announcing right there is right up there with Kirk Herbstreit and Al Michaels calling a Jaguars-Jets game on a Thursday, where it's a defensive 0-3 finish. Until we get to that next Final Frontier episode here on the Warp Core podcast, I want to thank all of our pending rebrand fans. We are 80 episodes deep. We're heading towards that century mark at warp speed. Thank you for being with us. Please make sure to like this episode, subscribe if you haven't subscribed, share us out if you are subscribed, recommend everybody else subscribe because we talk about the real here. Star Trek matters, and it's free. It's free to subscribe. It's free to like. And you can drop us any comments you feel at any time. Even if it's a LOL, what's your number, Lord Uther? Live long and prosper.
32.